got an amazing show lined up for everybody. This is a place where we have safe, organic conversations. We encourage to disagree as long as it's done in a respectful manner to one another. And people may have different views, so keep the conversation going in a respectful manner and let's level it up. So we're really thinking about professional discussions and arguments here. So I'm going to hand it right over to you, Gary, to take it away.
Thank you, Tamara. Well, welcome everybody, whether it's good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Well, today I have the real pleasure of introducing a person who really needs no introduction, Carsten Busch. Carsten's been on us with before, so welcome, Carsten. And the book we're going to talk about, one of many books, but we'll talk about its most recent, is the one you see on my background, The First Rule of Safety Culture, a counter C-word manifesto. So why don't we also get right into it? Carsten, what is the first rule of safety culture?
Thanks, Gary, for the nice introduction, and thanks for having me again. And well, letting me talk about my little hobby, which is safety in many of its forms. And well, the title of the book is, of course, inspired by the movie Fight Club, where there is a first rule of Fight Club, which is you do not talk about Fight Club. And I would like to suggest the exact same thing if you want to work on safety culture. Please do it, but don't speak about it, or at least as little as possible.
Yeah, so that's your second rule of culture, right? You do not talk about safety culture. Right?
You definitely don't talk.
Can you just give a brief minute? Why? I understand when you and I were chatting, you weren't planning to write this book, were you?
Well, I was planning to write a book about culture sometime in the future. I really was, and in my first book, Safety Mid 101, there's a little chapter on culture, and I suggested there probably will be a longer chapter in some future edition. But last summer, I was actually writing another book, a Dutch book on risk. And at some point, I got so fed up with a lot of talk about safety culture on LinkedIn mostly, that I just had to write a book. Pure frustration. I was so frustrated. I thought, now I have to get this culture book or this anti-culture book out of my system. And I sat down and I had 5 years of material lying around. And I think I wrote it in 6 weeks or something.
Cool. All right. Okay. Well, when you wrote the book, who did you have in mind as the reader?
Well, first of all, my many peers, other safety professionals, practitioners, and well, of course, all the people peddling safety culture programs and so on, because it's very much a critique towards what they are doing. And often, let's don't misunderstand me. I think many of these people are actually doing it with honest and good intentions, but it doesn't make it useful per se.
All right. Okay. So let's dive right into the book itself. It's a really easy book to read, and I found when I read it, I do get emotionally tied with you. I can see you kind of like venting a bit there and criticizing in a good way. So I think it's a fun read. Well, the book is divided into 6 parts. In part 1, the overture, you set a scene with some history on safety culture. And for many of us, the 1986 Chernobyl nuclear plant accident was the triggering event for another explosion. Because what it did is put a vast amount of attention and literature on safety culture. Can you further expand on that?
Yes, I can, of course, a bit. And please stop me if this is going to be a boring history lesson. We'll try to avoid it. But There has really been some writing and discussion of culture in relation to safety and risk before 86. And that goes back almost to the start of safety, because in 1920s, mid-20s, there is this chap, Louis de Blois. He was VP of safety, the first VP of safety of DuPont. And then he wrote a really nice book on safety organization. And there he suggests something he called safety atmosphere. If you read what he talks about, that's what we call culture today. Something in the air that affects people and well, helps them to work safely and so on. And also in the 70s and 80s, you find Barry Turner talks about culture. You have Mary Douglas, who talks very extensively about culture and risk. But then 86, Chernobyl happens, and the report mentions safety culture quite a lot. And somehow it caught on that time. It didn't catch on earlier, really. There weren't a lot of people discussing culture or atmosphere before 86. But after 86, people started repeating the terms, the phrase. And I guess that's because by that time, organizational culture had become a thing within management literature. Tom Peters, for example, with his excellence book, talks a lot about culture. Cotter does it. You had Deal and Kennedy, who did a quite famous book on culture, where they come with this definition of a culture is how we do things around here. So I think at that point in time, the world was just ripe to embrace the concept, and it's such a nice concept in several ways, good and bad. And well, it continued, and it continues still. It's you could say it was a fad or a fashion, but I think it's now common practice.
Yeah. So after that part one introduction, then you start kind of getting into it in the book. So in part two, you introduce an interesting term, cultural babble. What is the issue here, and what message are you trying to convey to readers?
Yeah, as I told you, and as I haven't mentioned in the book, but perhaps I should, the term culture babble, it was inspired by Alan Parsons Project, a song called Psychobabble. And the meaning or the message in that song is there's such a lot of psychological literature around that doesn't really add a lot of value, but it's very popular and gets repeated. And I thought that's the exact same thing that I see in relation to culture. People are repeating the term and using the term also, I would say, inappropriately, that they use the term more as a blanket to cover up, not intentionally per se, but to cover up other stuff that they really want to talk about. Let me just give an example. And this was one of the triggers of the book. I saw a message on LinkedIn, which was posted by the Dutch Railway Inspectorate, I think, about safety. We need to work on safety culture on the railways because people don't report enough, and we want to learn about accidents. So we need to build safety culture or improve safety culture. And I thought, no, you don't. What you really are talking about is people don't report enough, and they don't learn enough from events. Don't call it culture, because it only messes things up. People don't know what it is, what you're talking about. But if you talk about what your real problem is, then you will probably get much greater effect. But it doesn't sound as fancy, of course. So that's what I labeled culture babble. People are using the term just to sound fancy or whatever. Tamara, you have a question?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I want to just kind of push, because what you're saying right now is so important, and I've seen it also in action. So that is a mislabeling going on, but can you push a little bit further about what actually is going on, that the professional, because it is a concern if people are not reporting, but there is more going on there. So maybe if you could dive into that, what the more is.
Sorry, I don't quite, I don't entirely understand the question. You mean if people don't report, what's the problem with that? Well, one of the issues is, of course, that bad news.
Not what's the problem with that, but what is actually, it's not about the safety culture, right?
Yeah.
There are other elements going on there that need to be unearthed.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of people should be specific if you want improvements. If you want improvement, let's take a silly example. Say I feel a bit sick and I go to the doctor and the doctor says you should live more healthy. Thank you very much, but I would like to know what's the problem with me now and what can I do. Okay, living healthy in general is probably a good advice, but it isn't very helpful. I want something concrete, and yeah, it's the same with safety culture, and that you yeah, that you have an issue with learning, for example, and that you say, well, we need to improve our safety culture. Yeah, okay, but culture can be so much. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you have a good example when James Reason introduced the idea of there's a reporting culture, there's information culture, and there's a culture sort of stuff here. And I think that caused you to go like, well, why do we always have to add the word culture to the end of everything?
Yeah.
Why don't we kind of get more into it? And
yeah, and I really like Reason's work on this in his famous 97 book about management of organizational excellence or risk. I think it was in a way groundbreaking what he did, and then suggesting 5 different aspects to safety culture. And it's useful to think about it, but by labeling them culture, he also misses a lot, I think, because it only confuses more. Okay, we have safety culture, and safety culture is made up of reporting and learning and the other 3, just and yeah, informed, flexible. That's the 5. It just confuses things more, and there's more aspects than just these 5 to culture or the safety aspects of culture, because you could also say there's a trade-off culture, because safety is a lot about making trade-offs between production and other things, and then not in least safety, of course.
yeah.
So Vincent had a question. Vincent, you're muted.
Okay, good, thank you. Carsten, I like very much what you're saying. What I'm looking at here, and I wrote down some notes for myself, I'm viewing the word culture similar to what the word team meant in Japanese. Instead of people calling groups committees, everybody became a team. And frankly, team was not what the Japanese really meant. So basically, I see it in terms of the definition of the word culture. Okay, that is not clear to many people. For example, I see, if I look back many years, okay, safety was the job of the safety specialist. That was the whole culture. The safety specialist, that was their job. Nobody else had to worry about safety. That person would handle it. You look at the other end, and I'm looking at, I am my brother's keeper. I'm concerned about the safety of my coworker and myself. That is a different culture. So I think if we begin with the word, what in the world is the definition of culture? and are the two extremes that I just identify in that line.
I'm really glad you bring this in at this point, Vince. Thanks a lot. Because when Tamara asked about what's the problem about calling something culture, that there's actually the definition thing, because we all speak about culture all the time. We also speak about safety all the time, and we just assume that the counterpart knows what we are talking about, and that they have the same definition that we have. And that's probably not the case. And perhaps we're talking about entirely different kinds of safety, and probably we are putting different things into culture too. I saw he disappeared just from the chat that I can see here, but there was somebody who asked about behavior and culture. And there are a lot of people who believe that behavior and culture are basically the same thing. They are related, but they're definitely not the same thing.
Okay, can we just hold all the questions right now, because there's a lot of stuff in the book that we want to cover, and perhaps
really
as we
a
go through
question.
some of this stuff here, it's a good possibility that you may have your question answered. So let me do that first to set the stage, and then perhaps you can ask some questions after that.
It's not really a question, Gary.
Okay, go ahead then.
I want to amplify perhaps something that Carsten is getting at here. It came to me that the use of the word culture, when we use it, where it's really just a broad term when we don't understand the human elements in a situation. That's really essentially what it means. We don't really understand why this happens, so we're going to put it under the culture banner here. Because then everybody has a sense of understanding it. I mean, there is a gut understanding about what culture means. It means that there's all of these forces, all of these demands, all of these expectations from peers and bosses that are constantly impinging on us and directing the way that we behave. And it's just a very difficult topic. But I do think when we use the word culture, we all go, yeah, it's in that arena. What do you think about that, Carsten?
I think that's I had to write it down that weren't your words, I'm paraphrasing here, but the culture is an admission of we don't really know, but there's something. That's quite a nice definition, and I think that goes back to the origin of the term culture too, in anthropological sense, because that's where culture in the meaning of something happening between people comes from anthropology, not from engineering or management or whatever, but people who went out, watched some tribe of a group of people, and then saw that there were some regularities between these people in how they behaved, how they communicated with each other, perhaps how they dressed, the rituals they performed, and they saw, well, there's something governing their behavior, which we can't see, but it's there, and well, let's call it culture. And that external, internal force between the people in that group, well, that's culture. And as you say, Rosa, it's something that we don't quite understand, but we know there's something, and it's made up of beliefs, it's made up of rules, written or not, it's made of social conventions, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, there seems to be two contrasting views of culture. One is what we call the mechanistic engineering perspective, where we create a clear, predictable future state. We design a linear blueprint, and then we build it. The other view is ecological and treats culture as something that emerges and evolves towards an uncertain future. Can you shed some more light, Carsten, on the differences?
Yeah, I tend to say the first one that you described as the engineering approach to culture, I would say it tries to use culture as a tool. You have a group of people and you want this group of people to do something your way, like behaving safely, doing the work safe and all that. So you devise some kind of a scheme and which sounds more negative than I mean, but you devise something and then you try to implement it and yeah, you call that safety culture. And then on the other hand, which is more the anthropological view of safety, you have people who use culture not as a tool, but as a lens to look at a group and then try to understand what is going on in that group, and then use perhaps the results of that explanation to suggest the improvements if necessary, or well, sometimes you're just satisfied of having analyzed and well found an explanation for what they see. So I think that's the basic difference between the two. There's the first one, which is the one that's very much liked by management and consultants and also many practitioners see safety culture as one of several tools in the safety toolbox trying to improve safety. And then there's the second one that well, an accident has happened and then we don't use culture as a cause per se, but we use culture as a way of trying to understand what happened and why it happened. And Diane Vaughan's work on the Challenger incident is, I think, one of the greatest examples of the second way. She really immersed herself into an organization, studied NASA and their environment for 7 years or something, and then wrote, well, what is it, 450 pages, where she really well explains what she observes, what went on in the years up to the incident and also after, and then explains it from the cultural perspective of well, this is how they did work and this is why they did it.
Yeah. I like how you mentioned in the book how that second approach is guided by complexity science principles.
Yeah.
Can you mention a couple of those principles that we should know about?
In my book, I suggest some principles to look at culture, and one of them is about complexity. Let me just start with the first ones. I think when you are thinking about culture, you should at least keep 3 things in mind. The first is culture is not a thing. As we discussed, culture is what you observe, what you can't observe, but what you suggest is there when you observe a group of people interacting. You see these people, they behave in a certain way, they talk in certain ways, they dress in certain ways, and so on. And you suggest, well, there's some cultural influence. But you can't see culture in itself, you can't touch it. It isn't a thing, it's a construct we use to explain something. So that's the first. Culture is a construct, it's not an object, which makes it, for example, very hard to count culture or measure culture or whatever you want. The second thing is culture is about a group of people. It's not an individual thing. I don't have a culture. I'm a culture person, of course, but I don't have a culture myself. But if you watch my family interacting, you could suggest maybe there is a family culture here. If you go to my workplace, you will see some interaction there, and then you can infer, well, there's something in the group culture, the sub culture of my organization where I work, and so on. But culture is always about a group of people. It's not an individual thing, and therefore it's different from behavior. It's one of the reasons why it's different from behavior. And then the third thing, since it's a group of about a group thing, culture is a group thing. A group of people is a complex system. So culture is something that emerges from a complex system. And then I've tried to specify that a bit. Complex system, whatever comes out of it, it's not per se dependent on the parts, but mostly on the interactions. The cause-effect relationships are not necessarily linear. There will be linear effects, but also non-linear and surprising effects, and several. So we talk about the emergence then. I can't remember. Did you mention emergent in the second view of a culture?
Yeah, emergence. And I do like your other principle you mentioned, that culture is neutral. It is what it is.
It is what it is. It is the result of your system, and it's functional in its own way. And perhaps we don't like it. We may think, well, this culture, what we see in that group, it's not what we would like to have, but it has brought the group to where they are. So it has been functional for them, at least for a while. And perhaps it's turned sour on the ways and become dysfunctional for certain functions. But
Yeah.
It is what it is.
Yeah, and I do like your summary in the book where you say that improving the culture of an organization then means not addressing individual behavior, but the underlying system issues that create behavior.
Yes, and you can certainly try to work on it by addressing individual behavior, but it will be very tedious and long-winded and probably not successful. If you look at systems are made up of at least 3 things: parts, like people in a group. Then there's interaction between the parts, which are very essential. And then this group, this system, these parts, that they have a common goal. And if you want to affect the system very effectively, you either change the goal or you address the interactions. Working on the individual parts often is not very successful. But some parts, let's just acknowledge that, some parts of the system are probably more effectful than others. Like when you change out a CEO, it may have a greater effect than when you change out the safety officer in an organization.
All right. I've just been monitoring the chat panel, and there's quite a few questions. I think in parts 3 and 4 in your book, Carsten, you really address quite a few of these things because you talked about harmful safety myths that we must be aware of. And I think that brings back to your first book about safety myths. Can you just mention a few of them that you want to point out as things that we got to be very cautious of?
Yeah, well, I think the first one I mentioned already, that culture being measured and culture is measurable. Culture is not measurable as such because we don't know what culture is. Culture is just something we made up in our minds to explain something we observe. And then we connect certain things with this construct we have made, culture. Like James Reason did, he talks about reporting, and he talks about learning, and he talks about flexibility, and some other stuff. And then you could, of course, try to measure some of these things we connect to culture. So you could, for example, look into the number of reports in an organization. and track that from one year to the next, and then have an opinion whether things improved or not. And then you could say, well, that part of safety culture improved. But you're only measuring it. What you measure when you do a culture assessment is not culture as such. It's a number of things that you associate with culture, and that perhaps don't give the whole picture, most likely not. And perhaps you're even measuring stuff that doesn't say very much about culture at all. So that's one of the things. I'm mostly against trying to measure culture, I would say. That's not to say that you can't use these measurements for something good. So if you do a safety culture assessment, for example, I think you could use the results as very usefully to discuss with people and internally in the organization. Well, this is a measurement we did. What do we think about this? Is this how we like ourselves? Is there something we could improve? But then don't use the assessment, the measurement as an answer, but use it as a start of a discussion. I think that's the only useful way of using assessments or culture measurements.
Yeah. So one other, oh, go ahead, sorry, carry on.
No,
okay,
please.
Well, yeah, I'm just watching the time. We're at the bottom of an hour, and there's a couple more pieces I think I want to cover. So if we've got time at the end, we can come back and just let you know that in the book, Carsten covers a lot more myths if you want to get into it. So be sure to read that. But in parts 4 and 5, you delve deeper into the dark side of culture, where you talked about before, various safety culture as a tool offerings management can buy from consultants to tackle an immensely complex issue. What are you seeing that really makes you cringe?
Well, the thing that makes me cringe the most, and then really that makes me furious and fuming inside, is when people are trying to certify safety culture. And it's happening, especially in the Netherlands, where they took a transformed form of the Hearts and Minds tool that Shell had, based on the safety culture ladder by Patrick Hudson and so on. And they turn it into a certification scheme, which then is used as a tool to award jobs for contractors. And the thinking is, in a naive way, probably good. That you think, well, a company that is on a certain level on this culture ladder probably has a good safety and will probably deal with safety very well. So let's require a certain level, and then they can get a job. The problem is, and this is called Goodhart's law. If a measure is getting more important than what it tries to measure, then it loses all its value. So when a level on this ladder, on this safety steps, gets more important than safety, the level is important, because otherwise you don't get jobs. So you lose a lot of money, or you can't make money at all. People will do anything to get a position on that ladder that is required. And there are much easier ways of getting through a certification scheme than working harder on safety. So that really makes me fume, because it was a good idea, because I think this safety ladder idea, it is a useful way, again, to discuss internally what do we think about how we are doing on safety, but then twists it into something totally different. And I think the value for safety is gone.
Yeah.
And it gives an illusion of control to managers and all the procurement people, because, well, we have someone, we have a firm here who's on level 4 of this ladder, so they're really good. It's 4 out of 5. Wow. And then yeah, maybe they just got through the audit and yeah, don't do safety at all,
Right.
so to speak.
You have a really good section talking about culture by algorithm, because I think you and I had this chat about we're seeing a lot more commercial products coming on board saying, if you do this, you can reduce uncertainty. And here's a tool that somehow strips away complexity and makes it really simple for you. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, well, it's basically in all its forms, and in the book I mostly discuss this just culture algorithm, which is quite successful in at least commercial ways. It really oversimplifies the whole matter, and I also think it starts basically at the wrong end, because it starts by assuming that people did something wrong, instead of assuming that innocent until proven otherwise. But this is the other way around. This is we assume that you did something wrong until we can prove that you didn't, which is a bit weird. But it mostly oversimplifies the matter in a couple of yes/no questions, which don't do justice to the complexity that people are dealing with, and the various trade-offs they have to make in their work. And that's, I understand why these tools are successful, and I understand that they provide a sense of a process and system to management, who has to deal with a pretty tricky question, because okay, people make mistakes and make errors. That happens, and we need to allow this. But on the other hand, yeah, something really bad happened, and the easy way out is punishing somebody often. That's just how it is. Is there some help to get this done in a proper way? And these algorithms offer a way out, and I don't know, perhaps they're better than nothing. I'm not
I'm
sure.
just gonna jump.
I don't think, sorry, Tamara, I just finished my sentence. I don't think there's been any real research into this, whether they're better or worse. I think they're mostly very strong opinions. And until now, I'm in the I don't think it's a good idea camp. Sorry,
I'm
Tamara,
I'm just gonna jump in here, because Fred does have a question for you. So Fred, I've asked you to unmute. If you could ask Carsten.
Yeah, it seems that addressing, Carsten, good to see you, first of all.
Likewise. Hi.
Seems that the ambiguity of surrounding culture, that same ambiguity or misuse surrounds the word safety. And that safety, from my perspective, is only verifiable in past tense, but not looking forward. There's looking forward, you've got to manage risk, and you've got to do a lot of things to create a safe result. But what are your thoughts on that same ambiguity around the use of the word safety?
Yeah, safety. I have a piece lying around where I try to discuss what is safety, and you can approach it by so many different ways, and none of these give a complete picture. All only show a little part, and I would say yes, safety is most easily assessed in the back rear mirror, because then you see, oh, there we weren't safe, or not safe enough, perhaps. That's perhaps why I wrote a Dutch book on risk, because a risk is about the future, and that there's a lot of uncertainty about well, what's good enough, what's safe enough. But I think you can do something also proactively. You can certainly discuss if we approach things this way, and then have some sense about the risks there are, and the efforts you make. I think you can say, okay, we consider this safe enough, but keep in mind we may be off, because surprises do happen. The world is complex, and we don't know everything.
Well, Carsten, I'm dealing with a client right now, because this is all great discussion, but when you're in the field, in the moment, it's actually a very emotional issue. Because when somebody does something wrong, people crave justice, right? There's always people who want to see some kind of punishment. And in fact, this morning I saw a doctor who was being put in handcuffs, and I was so happy to see that, because he'd been abusing women for so long, and I thought, oh, good, and I thought to myself, well, that's not very restorative, is it, Rosa? But anyway, my client they had a big blow up. So now they're under scrutiny, and they have to improve their safety culture, because that comes from the regulators. You must improve your culture. So they're looking at just culture, and they're looking at psychological safety, how to get people to feel included and belong. But the very first thing they have to take care of is how are we going to discipline people? How are we going to hold people accountable? So I need some help, because how can you do restorative justice and get people to feel included and they belong and psychologically safe, when the very first question is, was the person on drugs? Was he willingly disregarding the rule? I mean, how can you go from that to psychological and maintain psychological safety? Oops, I think Carsten, I blew Carsten out of the water. Oh, there he is.
Yeah, I'm still there. There's something happening on the screen here. Great question, Rosa, and a very hard one that I don't have an answer to, because you have these different objectives that you need to address. You need to acknowledge, probably first, because there are different needs that are around, which is one of the underlying issues in a restorative justice, that there are needs that have to be met. And then how do you meet these needs best? There's probably no one solution for all these questions, I would say. And that isn't the answer that your client will want, because probably your client wants a flow chart. How are we going to deal with these things, and how are we going to deal with these things consistently and every time the same, because that's what the world expects from us, that we act consistently. Problem is, if you act consistently, if you follow a flow chart or the algorithm that starts the question, then you will do justice in some cases, but probably treat some people very unjustly. and that's a big problem. But I'm very conflicted here, I must say, because I understand the desire. Organization I work for is also one that needs to do stuff very structured and needs to show the world how we do stuff in a very transparent ways. And it's very hard to explain to people that, well, but this case is something special and we need to treat this differently, because most people don't look deep. Most people only look at the surface, and then that they will criticize you in the end, no matter what you do, probably. So if I had to solve and this is quite spontaneous now, if I had to solve the problem, I probably would suggest some kind of a procedure, but a flexible procedure that leaves a room for assessment at various points, and that you, well, get away with treating people differently, because people are different. Sorry, Rosa.
I just wondered if you designed something like that. That would be really interesting to see, because I think we need more diamonds in that matrix.
That's exactly what I meant. More assessing points where you, well, we do this way, or we do this the other way, and
So just
we can't solve it here now. So
thank you. I may have to call you and pay you for an hour of counseling.
Oh dear.
Okay. So we're in the last 10 minutes, and I want to give Carsten an opportunity to talk about his part 6. So now that we know what not to do, you write about looking forward, taking a segue from you, Fred, and what we should positively focus on. What do you suggest?
What I suggest, let's start at the beginning of our conversation. Please do work on culture, but try avoid talking about it. I think that's very useful to start with, and adapt your language to the people you are talking to. I was at this conference last month where I heard from a big company how they had adopted HOP, human organizational performance, in their processes. And the one thing that really stood out in their presentation was that they said we were very conscious in the language we were going to use towards frontline workers and managers. So they don't mention stuff like culture, psychological safety, resilience, and so on. They translate the concepts to language that people understand. So instead, they speak about that you have the opportunities to speak up safely without repercussions or whatever, or that they talk about when it comes to resilience, how do we handle unexpected situations, and how do we keep up safe production when surprises happen, and so on. So that's one thing. And just continuing on the language part, by calling things differently, I think you can affect culture also in very powerful ways. As I said, culture is about interactions between people. By changing the language and how people talk to each other, I think that's a very good way forward in changing things, nudging things, or influencing things in better ways. For example, instead of it's very popular at the moment, talking about accident investigation, talking about learning reviews or whatever. because that gives a bit of a different focus. When we had this session to prepare this session here, I told you, Gary, about the incident management system. When we implemented in my organization, we had to develop a new one, buy a new one, and then configure it for us. And at some point in the process, we decided we are not going to call it incident management system. We're calling it the improvement system, because we want to have it. It has to be wider than just investigating things going wrong. We also want to use it positively. And of course, the issue is not to report incidents. The issue is we want to capture learning opportunities and then learn from them. So we called it improvement system, and that's small drops that help to influence how we talk and interact, and I think that's very useful.
Mhm.
Good. Okay. Now, are there any questions? Tom, you've got one. Go ahead, Tom.
Just unmuting, sorry. Yeah, I wonder whether it's inappropriate to think of something being a bad culture. We do hear a lot of people say that it's a bad culture and it needs improving, and whether it's better to think of cultures as being inappropriate, or perhaps a mismatch between leadership and technician, or the culture of the organization and the risks that they're managing. You might have a culture that's very good at occupational safety and very bad at major hazards, for example. But we do seem to use this sort of good and bad, which you would never do in a wider context. No one ever would say, French Canadians are bad in their culture, but that's effectively what we do in safety. It would be completely inappropriate.
Yeah.
I just wonder whether there's a better way of thinking about it.
Oh, yeah, you are so right. I think we should drop the whole normative stuff. When people start talking about me, a good culture, or even a positive or proactive or whatever, I don't think it's useful, because you're just sticking a label on it, and it's also a bit from a downward looking point often. Well, we're better, and that's basically what happened with Chernobyl too, because it was a Western report that was written, and the underlying suggestion there is, an accident like that can't happen in Western Europe or the Western world, because it was due to the Soviet safety culture. So go figure. But the thing about we wouldn't do this to other cultures, we actually did. When we colonized other countries, other areas, we brought our European cultures and then stamped that on to the people that are living there, because, well, they were just barbarians or heathens, or, well, what you want to call them, that they didn't have a good culture. They needed our culture, which we exported. And we're still having the effects of that, good and bad.
Any other questions? Vince, you got one? Go ahead. Oh, got problems with your mute, not working. You're on.
There you go. Okay. Comment, and I have a question. I've experienced a safety culture. Maybe I've been around too long, but when I first started working in the chemical industry, and when I was told to go to human resources to acquire hard hat, shoes, gloves, whatever, because safety was an employee benefit. That was the culture. Safety was an employee benefit. So where we are today is truly a culture. What I've experienced over the years is culture takes time. At a minimum, up to 5 years, maybe a little bit longer. Carsten, I'd like your comment on the time.
I think I still don't have a conclusive answer to that.
Okay.
Let me start by saying that, yes, culture takes time. I think influencing culture in ways that you would like it to be, that takes time. Disrupting an existing culture and destroying everything that was before, that probably can be done overnight, because that's often just a matter of changing the CEO and then changing the management incentives, and there you go.
True. Yes.
So culture change can be very quick, but I'm afraid the results will probably not be what you like. But if you want to influence culture in ways that are positive, I think you need a lot of patience and a lot of breath to keep going, and then give another drip and give another drip and start again and influence yet another manager and so on. So yes
True.
and no.
Agreed.
Good. Well, we are at the top of the hour. So I'd like to ask my very last question to Carsten. What would be your 3 takeaways you would like to leave with the viewers?
Oh yeah, well, I did one. Don't talk about it, but please keep it in your mind. Use it as a lens rather than a possible tool. And as we said in the beginning, don't cover up actual matters with the term culture, because you will probably only confuse people and perhaps not address the thing that you really want to do something about, like making better trade-offs between safety and production and so on. And the most powerful way to work on culture, if you want, is probably do something on the interactions, like changing the language, or perhaps facilitating communication between people. Safety is all about trade-offs, so I think safety culture, if you want to improve it, improve the dialogue that there is between people in an organization. I think that's a very useful thing, and you don't need big programs for that. Just do it underneath, slowly creeping, and take your time, as Vin said.
All right, great. Well, we're at the top of hour, and I want to respect everybody's time. So Tamara, back over to you.
Thank you, Gary. This is a great conversation. And thank you very much, Carsten, for taking the time out of your day to join us. I think we need to continue the conversation. I'd like to get into the difference between culture and group dynamics, because I know that's something that is often left off of the table, and that can work into here for another time. But thank you to all our audience for joining us today and making this conversation possible. So on behalf of Safepedia, thank you very much.
Good. Thanks, everyone.